The wind came from the northwest in October of 1886 with a kind of patience that felt deliberate. It did not gust and retreat. It settled low and constant against every wall, every door frame, every gap between log and chinking along the Cheyenne River Valley in what was in Dakota Territory. Settlers in that stretch of the northern plains had already learned to fear a particular kind of silence, the silence that followed the first hard freeze, when the grass stiffened and the creek slowed at the edges, and the woodpile suddenly looked much smaller than it had in September. That autumn, a widow named Marta Voss was doing something no one in her valley had seen before. She was building a barn, not beside her house, not behind it, but around it, from the road. It looked like madness, a low-roof timber structure, rough-hewn and angular, rising up on all four sides of her existing log cabin, enclosing the way a crate encloses a jar. Neighbors slowed their wagons. Some stopped entirely. Most shook their heads and kept moving, chalking it up to grief. Her husband, Henrik, had died of fever the previous spring, leaving her alone with 2 children and 40 acres of hard ground. What no one understood yet was that Marta Voss was not grieving in construction. She was engineering. And by February of 1887, the temperature outside her walls would drop to minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 37 degrees Celsius, and stay there for 11 days. Every other family in the valley would burn through their entire woodpile. Some would burn furniture. One family would abandon their home entirely. Marta's fire went out on day 7. Her house stayed above 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius for the remaining 4 days, on stored heat alone. If you've never heard a thermal envelope built from a livestock shed, stay with me, because what this woman understood about heat, cold, and the physics of shelter will change how you think about every building you've ever lived in. Subscribe now, and every week we'll bring you one real technique that worked when survival depended on it. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and let's get into it. Marta Voss had arrived in Dakota Territory in 1879 with Henrik, a Norwegian-born carpenter, and the practical mindset common to Scandinavian settlers of that generation. She was 31 years old in the autumn of 1886, lean from field work, and possessed of an engineer's habit of asking why before asking how. The standard method for heating a frontier cabin in the Cheyenne Valley in the 1880s was straightforward and brutal. Burn as much wood as you could cut. Keep the fire going through the night, and accept that the room would drop to near freezing by dawn anyway. A typical log cabin of the era, roughly 16 by 20 feet, 4.9 by 6.1 meters, with a single-wall log construction and a stone fireplace on the north or east wall, could consume between 4 and 6 cords of firewood in a hard winter. That was the equivalent of a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 64 feet long. Cutting, splitting, and hauling that alone could consume a man's autumn. For a widow managing a farm alone, it was not a sustainable calculation. The deeper problem, the one that gnawed at Marta through the summer of 1886, was not the amount of wood, but the mechanism of loss. She had spent the previous winter watching her fire burn hot and watching her walls stay cold. The fireplace consumed wood quickly, producing intense radiant heat in a narrow cone in front of the hearth. But within 8 feet, 2.4 meters of the fire, the temperature dropped sharply. At the far wall, frost formed on the interior logs by mid-January. She understood, without the vocabulary of thermodynamics, what was happening. The heat was being pulled to the walls faster than the fire could replace it. A single-wall log cabin, even well-chinked, loses heat through 3 simultaneous mechanisms. First, conduction. Heat moves directly through wood fibers from the warm interior to the cold exterior, like a hand pressed against a window pane. Second, infiltration. Cold air seeps through gaps in the chinking and around door frames, replacing warm interior air in a slow, invisible drain. Third, and most destructively in windy plains conditions, convective stripping, wind moving against the outer wall, accelerates the transfer of heat through the logs by constantly refreshing the cold air on the exterior surface, preventing any thin, warm boundary layer from forming. Marta's cabin was losing heat on all three fronts simultaneously. More firewood would compensate. But compensation was not the same as solution. The solution, she decided, was not to build a hotter fire. It was to build a second wall. What Marta constructed beginning in September of 1886 was, in the language of modern building science, a thermal envelope, a secondary structure built around the primary one, creating a buffer zone of still air between the two layers. In vernacular terms, she built a barn frame around her house. But the details of how she built it are what separated the idea from mere insulation. The outer structure was a timber frame shed post and beam construction, approximately 26 by 32 feet, 7.9 by 9.7 meters in footprint, leaving a gap of roughly 5 feet, 1.5 meters, on three sides of the original 16 by 20-foot cabin and about 6 feet, 1.8 meters on the south-facing front. The roof of the outer structure was pitched at a steeper angle than the cabin's own roof, shedding snow load while also creating a dead air space above the cabin ceiling. A second insulating layer overhead. The gap between the inner cabin wall and the outer shed wall was filled, not with air alone, but with packed prairie hay and salvaged burlap grain sacks. Hay, when tightly packed, has a thermal resistance, what engineers call an R value, of approximately R2 to R3 per inch. Marta packed her walls to an average depth of 18 inches, 46 centimeters, giving her a composite wall assembly with an estimated insulating value somewhere between R36 and R54. By comparison, a standard single log wall of the period offered perhaps R1.5 to R2 total. She also made a decision that would become the most discussed element of her construction. She kept the south-facing wall of the outer shed partially open, not exposed, but vented through a series of slatted gaps near the roof line, similar in principle to a cold frame ventilation system. This allowed moisture that accumulated in the hay to escape as water vapor, rather than condensing and rotting the material from the inside. It was a crucial detail, and one that almost no one who criticized her plan had considered. Wet insulation is worse than no insulation. It conducts heat outward rather than resisting it. The floor of the outer envelope was packed earth, slightly lower than the cabin floor, and Marta ran a low stone curb around the base of the cabin's exterior wall to prevent ground moisture from wicking into the hay layer. The stone, local fieldstone gathered from a creek bed, also served a secondary thermal function. Dense stone absorbs heat slowly during the day and releases it slowly at night, acting as a modest thermal mass buffer at the base of the wall system. The entry to the cabin was redesigned as a covered vestibule, a short, enclosed tunnel through the hay-filled outer wall, with two doors separated by approximately 4 feet, 1.2 meters, of enclosed space. This airlock design prevented the direct exchange of interior warm air with exterior cold air every time the door was opened. Each time she and her children entered or exited, only the small volume of air in the vestibule was exchanged, not the entire cabin's thermal envelope. She completed the structure in 6 weeks, working mornings before the children rose and evenings after they slept. Her total material cost, according to a letter cited in a Ransom County settlement record from the period, was less than $4 in purchased lumber. The rest was salvaged timber, fieldstone, and hay she had grown herself. It looked, to every passerby on the river road, like a barn wrapped around a house, because that is exactly what it was. The criticism began before the outer walls were even framed. It came first from neighbors, then from tradesmen, and finally, and most damagingly, socially, from the man most qualified to judge, a Norwegian-born carpenter named Even Strand, who had built more than 30 cabins in Ransom County, and whose opinion on construction matters carried the weight of local gospel. Strand rode past the Voss property on a mid-September morning and stopped long enough to dismount and examine what Marta was building. Oral accounts preserved in a regional settler memoir from the 1920s record that he stood for several minutes, studied the frame, paced around the cabin, and then turned to Marta with a look she later described as the way a doctor looks at a patient who has decided to treat herself. "That hay will rot by February," he said, "and when it rots, it'll wick moisture into your logs, and you'll have black mold in your walls by spring. You're not insulating the house. You're building it a wet coffin." It was a memorable line. It spread quickly. By the following Sunday, it had been repeated in some form at the Lutheran church in Lisbon, where several Valley families worshipped. The wet coffin, the phrase lodged, other criticisms followed, each with its own social weight. A lumber merchant from Lisbon who passed through the valley in early October noted, not unkindly, that the outer structure would trap snow against the cabin walls, and snow against a log wall is frost inside by March. A neighboring farmer named Gunnar Halvorsen, who had farmed the valley since 1877 and had survived 4 hard winters without modification to his cabin, said simply that he had never heard of such a thing being done and saw no reason to start. "A tight chimney and a good fire is all a house needs," he said, according to a letter his daughter later included in a county history compiled in 1931. The social dimension of the criticism was harder to dismiss than the technical objections. In a Plains frontier community of the 1880s, shelter was not merely a practical matter. It was a statement of self-reliance and competence. A woman rebuilding the exterior of her dead husband's cabin in a way no one recognized was, by implication, suggesting that every other method was insufficient. That implication was not welcomed. What none of her critics fully addressed was the moisture question that Strand had raised, because Marta had already answered it. Her vented south wall, her stone moisture curb, her double-door vestibule. These were not afterthoughts. They were the engineering responses to exactly the failure mode Strand had predicted. She knew the hay could rot. She had designed against it. But no one asked her to explain her ventilation strategy. It was easier to dismiss the whole structure as grief-driven folly. She finished the outer walls in October and began packing the hay layer before the first hard frost arrived. Stay with me, because what happened in January of 1887 is a number that no one in that valley could argue with. I'll give it to you before this chapter ends. The winter of 1886 to 1887 is recorded in Northern Plains history as one of the most severe of the late 19th century. It is sometimes called the Big Die-Up Winter, primarily because of its catastrophic effect on the open-range cattle industry across Montana and Wyoming, but its reach extended east into Dakota Territory with equal brutality. Local accounts from Ransom County describe a January that arrived not with a single blizzard, but with sustained, grinding cold that settled over the Cheyenne Valley like a lid pressed onto a pot. By the 3rd week of January, temperatures in the valley had dropped to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 33 degrees Celsius, and were falling further. Wind from the northwest averaged between 15 and 22 miles per hour, 24 to 35 kilometers per hour, producing wind chill conditions that oral accounts described simply as killing cold, air that burned the lungs and froze exposed skin in under 3 minutes. The cold arrived not as a single event, but as a siege. 11 consecutive days without significant temperature recovery during daylight hours. 4 families heating with the standard single-wall log cabin and open stone fireplace method. The math became brutal quickly, with consumption double in the first 4 days as families fed their fires through the night to stay above dangerous temperatures. Even Strand, who had 3 cords of split oak stacked behind his cabin, burned through his first cord in under a week. Gunnar Halvorsen, the veteran farmer who had survived 4 previous hard winters without modification, burned greenwood when his dry supply ran low, producing more smoke than heat and coating his chimney flue with creosote that partially blocked the draft. On the seventh day of the cold siege, a neighbor named Lars Bjornsted, whose cabin sat approximately a quarter-mile northeast of the Voss property, ran out of dry firewood. His children were sleeping in their coats. He walked to Marta's outer door in the pre-dawn dark and knocked. She opened the inner vestibule door, then the outer one. The temperature inside her cabin, by her own account in a letter written to her sister in Minnesota that February, a letter preserved in the Minnesota Historical Society's Settlement Correspondence Archives, was 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius. Her fire had burned out the previous evening. She had not relit it. There was no fire in the cabin. There had been no fire for nearly 18 hours. Outside at that moment, it was minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 37 degrees Celsius. That is a difference of 82 degrees Fahrenheit, sustained without active heating by insulation and geometry alone. Lars Bjornsted stood in her doorway for a long time. He did not say anything about wet coffins. In the weeks following the January cold siege, a kind of informal accounting took place among the families of the Cheyenne Valley. The natural audit that frontier communities conducted after every hard winter, measuring survival not in abstractions, but in cords that would burn, nights of full sleep, and mornings when the water bucket was not frozen solid. The results for Marta Voss, compared against her nearest neighbors, were documented in scattered form across letters, a county surveyor's field notes, and the settler memoir already cited. They are not laboratory measurements. They are field observations, credible within the margins of frontier record-keeping, and they paint a consistent picture. Marta burned approximately 1.4 cords of firewood across the entire winter of 1886 to 1887. Her three nearest neighbors, all operating standard single-wall cabins with stone fireplaces in comparable structure sizes, burned between 3.8 and 5.2 cords each. On a per-square-foot basis, her heat demand was roughly 60 to 65% lower than the valley average. She had entered winter with 2 cords split and stacked in the outer envelope's lee. The protected south-facing gap between the inner and outer walls, where the hay layer and roof overhang, kept her with supply dry and accessible even during the worst of the drifting. The interior temperature stability was the detail that drew the most comment afterward. A typical cabin of the period, with a roaring fire maintained through a January night, might reach 62 degrees Fahrenheit to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 degrees Celsius to 20 degrees Celsius, near the hearth, but drop to 34 degrees Fahrenheit to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius to 3 degrees Celsius, at floor level and at the far wall, where children often slept. The gradient between hearth and floor could span 30 degrees Fahrenheit in the same room. Marta's cabin, due to the even, radiant character of heat retained in the log and stone mass of the inner structure, now buffered on all sides from convective stripping by the outer envelope, maintained a more uniform temperature throughout. Her children slept on a wooden floor platform 8 inches, 20 centimeters above the earth, and her account describes them as comfortable in single wool blankets during the coldest nights. The hay itself showed no significant rot by spring thaw. Her ventilated south wall and the stone moisture curve at the base had done their job. When she opened the outer wall sections in April to inspect the material, the hay was dry and intact. Strand's coffin had not materialized. The outer structure also served a function no one had anticipated. The stacked hay and enclosed space between the walls created a dead air buffer against the northwest wind that reduced infiltration to the inner log wall dramatically. Every gap, every imperfect chinking joint in her original cabin was now sheltered behind 5 feet of insulated dead space. Cold air could not reach her walls. The wind had nowhere to grip. 2 numbers stood out when the valley compared notes that spring. 48 degrees Fahrenheit inside with no fire for 18 hours, and 1.4 cords burned against a valley average of 4.5. Those 2 numbers traveled. Even Strand did not visit the Voss property until April, when the snow had receded enough to make the road passable without a sled. He came alone without announcement, and according to Marta's letter to her sister, spent nearly 2 hours examining the outer structure, testing the hay for moisture, probing the stone curve with a stick, studying the ventilation gaps on the south wall. He said very little. Before he left, he asked one question. How far did she keep the hay layer from the inner cabin wall at the base to prevent ground moisture contact? She told him 3 inches, 7.6 centimeters, of airspace between the hay and the log, closed at the top with a strip of salvage canvas to prevent convective air movement, while still allowing vapor to diffuse slowly upward. He nodded. He rode back down the road toward Lisbon. The following autumn, Strand built a modified version of the outer envelope around 2 cabins he was contracted to construct near the town of Sheldon, approximately 18 miles, 29 kilometers, southwest of the Voss property. His version used vertical board and batten siding instead of open timber frame, with a 12-inch 30-centimeter packed hay gap rather than Marta's 18 inches, a practical compromise that reduced material costs while preserving most of the thermal benefit. He did not publicly credit the Voss design by name, but in a regional carpenter's circular from 1888, a brief note described the double-wall method now being tested along the Cheyenne as a promising development for plains construction in extreme cold exposures. By the winter of 1888 to 1889, local accounts suggest that at least 9 homesteads within a 30-mile, 48-kilometer radius of the original Voss property had incorporated some version of the outer envelope concept, ranging from full double-wall systems to simpler hay bale windbreaks packed against the north and west walls of existing cabins and sheeted with rough lumber to hold them in place. The vestibule airlock concept spread independently and faster. It was simpler, cheaper, and immediately intuitive to anyone who had spent one winter watching cabin heat escape through an open door. Gunnar Halvorsen, the veteran farmer who declared that a tight chimney and a good fire was all a house needed, built a hay bale windbreak against his north wall in the autumn of 1887. He did not discuss it with his neighbors, but his wife, in a letter to relatives in Wisconsin, mentioned that their supply had lasted considerably longer than usual that winter, and that the children were sleeping without extra blankets for the first time in 4 years. The wet coffin became a warm house. The barn became the standard. What the community had dismissed as a widow's improvisation turned out to be a centuries-old principle, the same logic that Norse farmsteads had applied when they built eldest firehouses within larger longhouse structures that Alaskan Yupik builders had used in the Kashchik communal house, with its below-grade tunnel entrance, and that Russian frontier settlers had long employed in the Saini, an unheated anteroom that buffered the main living space from direct cold air entry. Marta Voss had not invented the concept. She had rediscovered it, alone, under pressure, from first principles, because the physics that made it work had not changed in 10,000 years of human winter. By the spring of 1889, Marta Voss had sold the Cheyenne Valley property and moved her family to Minnesota, where her sister lived. The outer envelope structure she had built remained standing on the property for at least 2 more decades, according to Ransom County land records, used by subsequent owners as combined storage and thermal buffer, exactly as she had intended. She left no published writings on building technique. She filed no patents. There is no statue. What she left was a set of ideas embedded in construction choices of 9 or 12 or 20 families along a river valley in Dakota Territory, ideas that reduced their firewood consumption by half, kept their children sleeping warmly, and turned one brutal winter from potential catastrophe into a manageable hardship. What she understood, what even Strand had missed, what Gunnar Halvorsen had not needed to know until the winter of 1887 taught him, was that the enemy of a warm house is not cold air. Cold air is inert. It cannot reach through a wall. The real enemies are conduction, convection, and infiltration, the 3 physical mechanisms by which heat travels from where you want it to where you do not. A bigger fire fights conduction by raising the interior temperature, but it does not slow the rate of loss. A wider chimney improves combustion, but does nothing for the wall. More firewood is compensation without solution. A second wall solves the problem at its source. It interrupts conduction by placing a low-conductivity material, hay, air, any fibrous or cellular substance, between the warm interior and the cold exterior. It eliminates convective stripping by removing the wind's access to the outer surface of the structural wall. It blocks infiltration by burying every gap and crack behind an insulating buffer that cold air cannot penetrate quickly enough to matter. The geometry is simple. The physics is ancient. The results are, by the standards of that valley in January of 1887, extraordinary. 48 degrees Fahrenheit with no fire. 11 days of siege. Children sleeping in single blankets. With supply intact. Marta Voss was not stubborn. She was not eccentric. She was not driven by grief into irrational behavior. She was a woman who looked at a thermodynamics problem, identified its 3 failure modes, and engineered a solution from field stone, hay, salvaged timber, and 6 weeks of pre-dawn labor. The neighbors laughed in September. In February, one of them knocked on her door to warm his hands. That is a recurring lesson of frontier engineering. The people who survive the worst winters are rarely the ones with the most firewood. They are the ones who understood, before the cold arrived, why the wood was running out in the first place. If this story changed how you think about heat and shelter, give a like. It helps more people find this kind of history. Subscribe so you don't miss next week's technique. And leave us a comment. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever lived through? We read every one.